Hello everyone, welcome to the first online research seminar for the CRC for this year. Welcome back to 2021 and channeling our national leadership. It's the year that we really want to keep out of the bin. So it's good to have you all with us. For those new faces, and I do note a few new names, my name's Dave Lamb. I'm the Chief Scientist of the Food Agility Cooperative Research Centre, and I'll be your MC. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands and waters on which we all live and work. I would also like to pay respect to the elders of these lands and waters, both past, present and emerging. So welcome. For those of you that are unfamiliar with our CRC, Food Agility is dedicated to unlocking the power of digital and data to transform our agri-food sector. And the topic of today's seminar presentation is very, very timely. Before I introduce our host and our speakers, I'd like to cover off a little bit of housekeeping first. Just to remind you all, the session is being recorded and ultimately we'll make this recording available to you. So we welcome questions and please use the Q&A tab, not the chat tab, the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. Unfortunately, it's not possible for you to be able to ask the presenter questions direct. But if you log them on the Q&A tab, I'll work through them and we'll retail them to the presenter in a conversation type style at the very end. And of course, if you think of any questions, please keep populating the Q&A tab and I'll ensure that we communicate them. If it turns out that we run out of time, I'll cherry pick a couple of indicative ones. And I certainly encourage you to catch up with our speaker and our host offline as well. So let me introduce to you Dr. Madeline Mitchell. Maddie is an industry research fellow based at RMIT in Melbourne. And Maddie will introduce both the food agility constellation that's intimately concerned with this particular topical area that we're going to cover today, that she leads, as well as introduce our speaker. So without any further ado, welcome, and I'd like to introduce Maddie.
Thanks, Dave. I will share my screen. Give me a moment. Okay. So, great. So I'd first off like to acknowledge that I'm calling from the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and I would like to pay my respects to traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original stewards of our natural capital, and I'd like to thank them for their continuing care for country. So this is the challenge facing agriculture right now. We have a growing population, we have limited land, and we also need to do our bit towards our net zero goals. So this really isn't just about land sparing. Agriculture can also play a part in restoring our ecosystems, maintaining or improving our natural resources, our natural capital. And in an ideal world, we'd also see farmers rewarded for the public benefits provided through good environmental stewardship. So investing in natural capital is likely to increase farm businesses' profitability in 4 ways. And so first off is increasing income by improving the yield or the quality or the market value of the products, and potentially by accessing additional revenue streams like soil carbon credits or biodiversity offsets. It may also decrease costs by using inputs more efficiently, reducing waste and asset depreciation. The business may also be improved by increasing resilience to climatic and other stresses. And for example, better soil health and soil organic carbon can increase water holding capacity and make crops and pastures more resilient to dry conditions. And finally, we can see this might increase and protect the long-term value of the land and thus the farm assets. So why might farmers not be investing in this? At the moment, we're seeing evidence of some perverse outcomes. So for example, a farmer that wants to improve their natural capital management might need to spend a certain amount of money to do so, to make a practice change or to plant trees or whatever's required. And so this initial investment might mean they end up looking riskier to a bank, for example, who's trying to assess their loan. And some people can see, for example, tree cover as lost land for livestock or grazing or cropping. And so that tree cover becomes a kind of liability there. The other thing we're seeing is things like the carbon credits, the Australian carbon credit units. They are really long-term projects, and biodiversity projects can be in perpetuity. So this can be seen as a bit of a negative because it can limit what you can do with the land. So there are a few hurdles to overcome there. So the Natural Capital Constellation, or the full title is the Natural Capital Constellation for Climate Resilient Farm Systems, is a research program that's aiming to help build the business case for natural capital. And so this includes work to make monitoring and reporting on natural capital more accessible to farmers, to support them in better on-farm management. And this should increase their resilience, may allow them to access new revenue streams, and through this, lower their financial risk. And so importantly, natural capital risk assessment that Francisco is going to talk to you about can help identify the risks and the indicators and the metrics to focus on. And so it's for this reason, this element of reducing financial risk and increasing resilience, that means that IAG and NAB have actually come on board to co-fund this constellation work. Now, I'm going to hand over to Francisco, who's going to talk more about natural capital risk assessment and financial institutions. So I'll stop sharing screen. Excuse me. And give me a second. All right, so 2 seconds, where are we? All right, so I would like to introduce to you now Dr. Francisco Ascui. So he is our Food Agility Natural Capital Advisor. And so he's an internationally recognised expert in natural capital accounting, in finance and risk management, and he has over 20 years experience across business, government and academia. And so among his many degrees and other achievements, his work on carbon accounting was identified by the UK Economic and Social Research Council as one of 50 landmark research contributions over the last 50 years. And in recent years, he has pioneered this new approach to evaluating natural capital risk in agricultural lending. And this has been officially published now as a guide by the Natural Capital Finance Alliance. So I will pass over to Francisco now to talk to you about that in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie, and thanks, Dave, for the introductions and background. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to my presentation. Just share my presentation now. So I'm going to talk about natural capital risk assessment in agriculture. Over the next 25 minutes or so, I want to try and get through these 3 questions. What is natural capital risk assessment, or NCRA? Why is it relevant? And how do you do it? So starting off with what is natural capital? Apologies for those of you who are very familiar with it, but something that has many different definitions. Most of them will talk about stocks of natural assets. So things like natural resources, mineral resources, and so on, and ecosystems that provide us with flows of environmental goods and services, things like timber and food and flood mitigation, which directly and indirectly underpin the global economy and human well-being. So it's not all natural assets, it's really just the natural assets that provide us with something of value. So it's important to recognize the kind of conceptual baggage that comes along with the term natural capital. It is a very human-centered view. There's a lot of other natural capital that simply exists out there and provides services, to other parts of the environment without really interacting with human beings. And that's not really what the natural capital approach is concerned with. That doesn't mean that we're reducing the environment to consumption or to monetary value. There can be a lot of other ways of valuing natural assets. You might want to just keep it there for future generations. We might also just value the fact that it exists and has no use value beyond that whatsoever. So the natural capital coalition's put this nice diagram together that just summarizes, that it's stocks of assets that produce flows of services and goods that have value to business and society. What is risk? Again, something with many different definitions, different understandings. I like that definition up there from Brian Hardiker, which is that it refers to uncertainty of outcomes that are significantly different to expectations. Those outcomes can be positive or negative, but we usually worry most about the negative outcomes rather than the possibility of unexpected benefits. What you understand by risk really depends on your value perspective. So, for example, a business perspective versus whole of society perspective, the kind of outcomes that you're interested in, such as the financial bottom line versus health outcomes. It also depends on your tolerance of risk, your expectations, whether it's one-off or repeated, relative magnitude. If you think about gambling with your lunch money versus your life savings. So all of these things make risk a very relative and qualitative concept, even though we try to quantify it. And I'll be talking largely about operational risk for a producer, which usually translates to kind of bottom line financial outcomes. And that in turn becomes a credit risk for a lender to the producer or an investment risk for an investor in the producer. So if you put the two together, natural capital risk assessment is the process of assessing risk arising from impacts and or dependencies on natural capital. So I'll explain impacts and dependencies by putting it into context with kind of more traditional environmental thinking. So if we go back a few decades, it would have been typical for a business to think of itself as completely separate from the environment. As we became more aware of environmental impacts and governments started to regulate to protect the environment, businesses became more aware of their impacts, and banks started to look at things like the risk of lending to a business that might then be shut down through not receiving licenses to operate under environmental regulation. So that's what we would call kind of environmental risk assessment, as opposed to natural capital thinking, which really recognizes that business and the economy sit within the environment. And we not only have to think about the impacts that we have on the environment, but the dependencies. So if that was a biomass power station, it might depend on a sustainable flow of biomass from the timber, from the forests around it. It might also depend on water from the river for its cooling towers. And those dependencies in turn can be threatened by a variety of other change processes, which gives rise to risk. So why is natural capital risk assessment relevant? Really for the same reason that any kind of risk assessment is relevant. The better you can understand and characterize a risk, the better you can manage it, and in financial terms, the more efficiently you can allocate capital. So if we start with the producers, if they understand what their natural capital risks are, they can improve the management of their natural capital. That should lead to lower risk and a better return on their own investment. If they're able to communicate that effectively to the finance sector, then they should be able to benefit ultimately from improved access to capital, because the finance sector in turn should see lower risk across the portfolio and therefore a better return on their own investments, as well as being able to identify new opportunities that come from changes in natural capital and to meet increasing stakeholder expectations around managing natural capital. And of course, ultimately, it's the environment itself that we hope to benefit through reduced impacts, improved resilience, and being able to therefore continue to support the economy and society into the future. agriculture is really probably the most relevant sector for natural capital risk assessment because it's a major source of impacts. So for example, cereal production and livestock together have been estimated to produce about $2.3 trillion of natural capital damages each year, which is, I think, 150% of their economic value. So they're actually running down the natural capital base that they depend on. It's also the sector with the greatest dependency on natural capital, as shown in the diagram there, another publication from the Natural Capital Finance Alliance. And as Maddie mentioned, it needs significant investment in the innovation and growth to drive, a more than 50% increase in productivity by 2050 to feed a growing population. So for all of those reasons, it's very, very important that we get the capital into the right type of agriculture to transform the agricultural sector over the next 30 years. So moving on to how you do it. In the last few years, a generic approach has come out and become quite widely accepted across the business sector, which is the Natural Capital Protocol. That really sets out just a very general framework that guides a business in how it should do any kind of natural capital assessment. Starting off with framing, so thinking about your values and your assumptions and perspectives that frame the way that you would consider the assessment. Scoping, what should be included, what should be excluded, then going out and actually doing it, measuring it, and then applying the findings and taking action. However, it doesn't really give you any specific guidance for how to do natural capital risk assessment. And specific guidance on that has only come out in the last 2 years. All of these are published by the Natural Capital Finance Alliance, including the website on the left-hand side, which is called Encore. And the three on the left are really about taking a portfolio approach to natural capital risk assessment. So looking at, really at a global level, what your exposure might be as an equity investor or as a large international bank. Whereas what I'm going to talk about is the approach on the right, which is asset level. So how do you actually assess risk at the level of an individual farm? So that's particularly applicable to lending, which is very important in Australian agriculture. So this approach is based on the Natural Capital Protocol. So it has the same 4 stages: framing, scoping, actually measuring, and then applying the findings. I'm going to talk mainly about the guts of it, which is the scoping and the measuring part. So the scoping stage, a really important part of that is materiality assessment. So materiality here is taken in a really broad sense. So basically anything that is relevant to look at, depending on the decisions that you're wanting to make, as opposed to the narrower definition of materiality for financial reporting, for example. So this is really about narrowing down the scope of an assessment, because if you, for example, look at international classifications of ecosystem services coming from natural capital, there are hundreds. So if you were to assess every single possible ecosystem service that you might depend on, you would be there all day and you'd barely start. So it's essentially a pre-assessment to identify the key risks that are worth looking at in more detail. And it can be done for any reasonably homogeneous subsector or geography. So, generally, I'd say at minimum, considering that countries can be quite different from each other, you might want to, for certain sectors, look at much smaller regions, such as, southwest of Western Australia, has a particular climate and everything like that. So it might be quite relevant to look at that level of detail for certain subsectors. Agriculture is really challenging because it's so diverse, and what is a risk for one type of cropping might be an advantage for livestock production. So it really depends on being specific about the subsector that you're looking at and the geography. This diagram really summarizes how I think about both materiality assessment and risk assessment. As I said, that materiality assessment is just a kind of pre-assessment. So they're essentially the same step. So it's a bit of a complicated one. It starts off with the company, the producer, in the middle. I've also got supply chain in there. I'm not going to talk about supply chains really, but just that's recognizing that when you move away from the agricultural sector, most companies are actually only indirectly exposed to natural capital through their supply chains. Whereas, producers on the land are every day directly dependent and directly having impacts. So starting with the company in the middle, on the right-hand side, we have the concept of an impact pathway. So the company does something which we call an impact driver. So that can be either on the consumption side, the input side, like consuming a resource, or producing a waste product like emissions. That drives impacts. So those impacts are then seen in a change in natural capital. So, for example, running down the stocks of a natural resource, or causing climate change through an increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Sometimes that change in natural capital can directly affect the ecosystem services that the company depends on and come back to affect the company in that way. And that's the kind of ecosystem response that I show at the top. Also, very commonly, there's no direct impact like that, but the impact is seen at some level in society and results in some consequence. So that could be regulation that says you can't do this or you get a fine. It could be seen in the form of sustainability certification that you would lose if you produce a certain impact. It could be seen in losing preferred buyer status with a preferred supplier status with an important buyer, and so forth. And that's the kind of societal response that I show at the bottom there. On the left-hand side, we have the idea of a dependency pathway, where a company depends on an ecosystem service that might change due to a change in the natural capital that provides that service. And that change is then usually driven by some broader environmental or social changes. So thinking about those pathways, they're already kind of a simplification of the kind of real causal pathways that would be out there in reality. But if you were to assess the probability of change at each stage and then add it all together, it would quickly become extremely complex. So my approach is to break down both impact pathways and dependency pathways just into two sections, which you can then easily combine in a way that's very transparent. So to explain what I mean there, the first of those on the dependency side is the degree of dependence. So do you depend on something to such an extent that your operations will shut down if you don't have that ecosystem service? If you do, that's obviously a higher degree of dependence. If you can carry on by substituting or changing your processes slightly, then that would suggest a low degree of dependence. And then secondly, you evaluate the severity of the threats. to the natural capital that provides those important ecosystem services. Similarly, on the impact side, you can assess the degree of impact, and that's usually a function of both the magnitude of the impact, so like how much of a pollutant you're producing, and the sensitivity of the environment. So if you're polluting a very sensitive, threatened ecosystem, that's obviously a bigger impact than polluting an already degraded environment. And then you have to assess the severity of the consequences, which, as I said earlier, might be those kind of direct consequences from affecting the natural capital that you rely on, or the indirect impacts of society responding to your impacts. So by breaking it down into those two sections, it enables quite a transparent approach where you're simply assessing two elements and then combining them. So I've done this now for quite a few different agricultural subsectors, and the same general categories of risk tend to come up across all of them. So this is the kind of first level of simplification that we suggest that we can focus on just these key areas of risk. That doesn't mean that that is going to be totally comprehensive in all possible situations. So for example, if you have a farm on the slopes of an active volcano, you might want to have a volcanic eruption risk under the land and soil category. But I would be pretty confident that in most situations, these categories would cover 90% of your relevant risks. So to illustrate, a couple of points about that. One is that I've got a whole category for weather and climate. Climate is usually not considered in most natural capital research because it doesn't lend itself to the idea of thinking of climate as an asset. But when you think about agriculture, clearly we are always very, very dependent on a certain ambient climate and weather conditions. So it's extremely relevant from a risk perspective. The other thing is that you often hear about environmental goods and services in terms of ecosystem services, so the benefits that we get from ecosystems. But it's important to recognize that we also get disbenefits or ecosystem disservices like weeds and pests and diseases. So just to illustrate how these areas are relevant to different sectors, these are the categories that I would say are most relevant to Australian wheat production. And these are the categories that are relevant to beef production. So a lot of them are similar, but there's a few differences, such as obvious ones like animal welfare being only really an issue for livestock. As an example of how this can look in practice, here are the results for the dependency risks for wheat and beef and sheep production. And you can see that water availability and extreme weather and pests and diseases and weeds all come up as highly material for all of those sectors. But there are differences in some of the other categories. And as you would expect, the two livestock sectors are pretty similar. But again, there's a bit of a difference, particularly in relation to sheep exposure to temperature extremes. Moving on to the measurement stage. This is just a very, very basic model or suggestion for how to assess risk. Risk is really about what will happen in the future. So it's really the unknown future that you're trying to assess. However, it's usually relevant to start with an assessment of the current or recent historical situation. If, for example, you're farming already at the frontier of where it's possible to farm in terms of rainfall, for example, then you're obviously going to be a bit more exposed to a risk of reduced rainfall than someone who's kind of in the middle of the zone. So it's relevant to start with that assessment of the current situation, but given a changing environment, that doesn't tell you the whole story by any means. So really the most relevant thing is what's the likely future trend. And then a couple of things that can come into play there are also kind of the social aspect of whether a risk is likely to be actually priced in future. This is particularly relevant for impact risks. So something like greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just sufficient to think about what's going to happen with your physical emissions. You have to think about what's the probability of being liable, having to pay a price for those emissions. And finally, for most of these risks, there are very effective mitigation options available. And so it would be relevant to assess the farmer's ability to mitigate risk in order to come up with an overall assessment. So moving on from kind of the theory of how you do it to the practicality, you need to identify for each risk area, what is it that is actually driving the adverse outcomes that you're worried about. So with something like rainfall or water availability for wheat production, it's not just simply the quantity, it's not the average rainfall for the whole year. It's when you get it, how reliable is it, and also depends on the water use efficiency of your actual crop. So by breaking down a risk into those sorts of components, you can come up with indicators that are relevant to that specific component. So in New South Wales, at least, the rainfall during the early growing season seems to be highly correlated with yield. So that might be a relevant indicator. For reliability, you might use a variability index. For water use efficiency, you might look at the average millimeters per tonne of wheat. And there's, for these sorts of things, lots of data that's available, historical rainfall data from the BOM, producer records that would tell you about things like the yield, and climate models that can give you an idea of what the likely future projection is going to be. Another example for soil quality, much more complicated, but there are probably a few headline risk factors like acidity and salinity and erosion and loss of soil carbon that you could at least start by tracking and measuring. And again, there are various data sources for all of those. You might be wondering sort of how practical is this? And this is something that I've been working on recently, where we've looked at sheep production. And basically we've found that at least moderately practicable indicators and data are available for all of the most material dependency risks. So the two lines on the diagram, the orange line is the materiality, and the blue line is the practicability of there actually being suitable indicators and data out there. And you'll see that in general, there's a reasonably good match. Some things are very difficult, like biodiversity impact, biodiversity dependency, but fortunately that's not something that's highly material for sheep production. Impacts on the whole are something that we've had much longer experience of measuring and monitoring, and so they're generally easier to assess. The bottom line, I think, is that decisions still have to be made even if you haven't got perfect information. So I think it's better to move forward with something that's slightly better than the current situation, even if it's definitely not perfect. Finally, if you've got your indicators and your data, you have to actually say, well, okay, what does that mean in terms of risk? This was really done in terms of thinking about credit risk. Credit risk is often assessed in a qualitative way. So things like the quality of management is assessed through talking to the borrower and making a qualitative judgment about that. But ideally, you also want to obtain quantitative data that you can start to correlate with outcomes over time and do proper actuarial analysis on. It's really important to understand what key thresholds are. So, things might track in a nice linear way for a while and then fall off a cliff. So you need to understand where that cliff is. And if you adopt this kind of view of looking at the historical situation and the future projection and looking at the risk mitigation, somehow you've got to combine those things together. So the table on the right is an example of a kind of just a logic table that says that each stage moderates the stage before, and that gives you an overall assessment. So again, not perfect, but it's a way of starting. And that's what it might look like in a kind of traffic light system. And that's the kind of information that you might imagine a credit officer looking at when they're assessing an application for a loan in future. So I hope that's covered what natural capital risk assessment is and why it's relevant and how you do it. 5 years ago, if you'd asked me, when would we see banks starting to do this, I would have said maybe about now. And that hasn't really happened, although NAB has experimented with putting the sorts of information that are in the screenshot there in front of their credit officers. I think it's going to take a few more years, but I think that a big driver might be the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which is being set up later this year, modeled on the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, which has really driven an explosion of interest in climate risk in the last year or so. So I think in the next couple of years, when we see the kind of outputs from that TFND process, I think this really might start to move forward. So I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much for listening. There's my email if you want to follow up offline, and I've also provided some links to other documentation there. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you, Maddie, also for your opening comments. Francesco, I've got quite a few questions that have streamed in, and they all seem to start when you started putting up your spider diagrams, because you were giving light to, I guess, the quantification, the way things are measured. So I've got a couple of questions on the tab, and I've also had a few come in via SMS, if I may. So you talked about materiality values in your radar diagram. And you actually then, of course, went to more sophisticated forms where you had the materiality and the practicability, if you like. So going back to materiality, can you give us a bit of an insight into how you land on the quantitative values for that sort of thing? Maybe pick one and just show us how that thing's rated.
Okay, let me share my screen again. Okay. So how did we assess this? It was a combination of literature review, so assessing what the literature says in terms of the most likely impacts on profitability are likely to be ultimately driven by changes in yield or productivity, changes in costs, or changes in the price that you can get for a product. So we looked for evidence of significant, like, more than 10, 20% changes in those sorts of drivers likely to result from changes in the risk factors. The practicability, we again assessed based on a review of basically we pooled the views of a group of experts and considered a number of parameters such as the availability of data at the right scale, the right frequency, the right accuracy, and so forth. I think that if I go back to if I go back to this diagram, this provides a really systematic way of assessing materiality or assessing risk. But again, it's a bit of an art rather than a science. So you ultimately have to come to a qualitative judgment about things like the degree of dependence, but you can be informed by the evidence in terms of literature review or expert opinion. Same with the severity of threats.
So Francesco, maybe if you could just share the screen as well, but if I could build on the question, because it's coming through a couple of channels. In those spider diagrams, you talked about practicability, and biodiversity was one that was really stood out. And in the sheep example you gave, the biodiversity practicability was 0.
Yep.
I guess what do you see to be the challenge with that? Is it a lack of appropriate data, lack of engaged expertise, capacity within this industry to quantify? Have we done enough science behind it? Why is biodiversity lagging, if I could use that term, given, for example, that biodiversity often gets held up, certainly in mainstream thinking around indicators of the future viability or resilience of a particular sector? What's the problem with biodiversity?
I think complexity. So, typically you don't just depend on one species. You depend on a web of species in an ecosystem, and that's complex. The difficulty of measurement. So again, even if it's just a single species, typically any kind of biodiversity measurement is a costly exercise. I think it's really interesting, there are interesting possible ways of developing proxies for biodiversity, like using bioacoustic monitoring, for example, or using indicator species as a way of indicating the overall richness of a broader ecosystem. But yeah, I think that those two things make it very challenging.
So, Francesco, you referred to, I guess, consulting experts and pooling feedback around the way you would quantify something. Was there a particular protocol that was developed for that particular aim in mind to follow in order to, to elicit expert opinion and to give it sort of a ranking? Can you give us a sense of how you got that expert advice brought in?
Yeah, well, we just followed a kind of expert elicitation protocol. So we had a rubric. We had those parameters of practicability. That was the first task, was to kind of try and nail down what we meant by practicability. And then we got everyone to do it independently, and then compared the results and had a discussion to talk about areas of divergence. So sometimes that brought people together because we realized it was not a fundamental disagreement about the practicability. It was a disagreement about the understanding of what we meant by something. And then the final result reflects the kind of group average.
Okay, thank you. You towards the end, you talked a bit of, you made a reference to credit officers and banks and maybe doing some trial work with those sort of assets at their fingers, that sort of data intelligence. Can you tell us a little bit about your view of the bank's perspective of this? Like, it would strike me that are we looking at a community in banking that are going to be trained and equipped to use and interpret that data, or is it really about individuals utilising it to whatever value they see fit? Have you got a sense of how this could be instituted, or what the current status is in terms of how the banks are facing up to these sort of assets when it comes to understanding risk?
Yeah. Well, look, I think that in agricultural banking, it's still relationship banking, and you still have credit officers who've got a lot of experience in the sector dealing with the loan applications from that sector. So I think that, if you put a natural capital risk assessment framework in front of them like this, they would understand a lot of it, and they would actually probably say that they take a lot of it into account through their kind of tacit knowledge. So the issue is really about, is it likely that sort of relationship banking is going to continue into the future? I mean, everywhere else we've seen it kind of drop away in favor of more algorithmic, data-driven lending, because that human factor is expensive. So moving towards a more standardized approach to natural capital risk assessment that can actually be linked to independent data streams and all kind of automated does have some attraction from that perspective, I think, to the banks. The other thing is just making it more consistent. So, you might have very experienced people, but, you've always also got less experienced people coming into the team. And, how do you make consistent judgments across an organization? And again, having a standardized framework and the same data in front of the people is a way of promoting consistency.
Is there a negative side to that, Francesca, or not? Do you get a sense of the counter to that around the notion of taking the people out of the equation and the notion of this is something that may be imposed? Do you get a sense of any flags of pushback or potential pushback that may need to be factored into when developing and rolling out approaches like this?
I haven't. I mean, if anything, I guess when I started this work, I expected producers to be a bit sort of suspicious of it and think that, that they might end up being penalized by having this sort of scrutiny of their operations. But whenever I've presented on it, I think the majority of producers at those presentations, at least, have been really enthusiastic. And I mean, it may be that they're industry leaders, and that's why they're at a talk like that. But I think in general, a lot of producers would see this as a way of demonstrating the fact that they are managing their natural capital well and being able to create a benefit from that, rather than being worried about being penalized by closer scrutiny. I don't really know about how this would be seen in terms of internally to banks. I think they're pretty used to the whole idea of constant streamlining and efficiency in operations, and it's just way of life, I think.
And what about the other side of the fence, the producers, the producer groups? You talked about beef as an example and sheep, and even, for example, when you in your opening slides, you talked a little bit about the understanding the criticalities of certain sectors, irrigation and so forth. What are you getting from those industries themselves in terms of the applicability, the value, the excitement around this sort of approach? Have you got any indicators from your conversations with those sort of sector stakeholders?
Yeah, well, like I said, when I have presented to sector stakeholders on this, they have been really enthusiastic, and they've seen it as a way of communicating what they're doing. They've also seen some applications that I hadn't really thought of, such as using it in discussions about succession. So if you're handing down the farm to one child and you want to ensure that the other child is, equally compensated, it may not seem totally fair to just take a market price for the farm as the basis for that comparison. You might want to, value in some way the inherent riskiness or resilience that you've built up in that property. So yeah, I think there are a number of applications, and they also see applications in terms of communicating with the supply chain.
So thank you, Francisco. Maddie, just over to you, because I understand you have been doing some work in recent times with the grape and wine industry. I thought you may have an example that you might like to share with us of some of these sort of initiatives.
Yes, I even have conveniently a little slide or two. Give me a moment. Yeah, so this is really early stages. So we had a project in viticulture early on in the CRC, and then this is now something that Francisco and I are going to keep going with. So this is the beginning project. So basically, what this project was doing, it was with oh gosh, my keyboard's a bit sensitive. So it's looking at, it's linking financial and environmental benchmarking for better decision making in viticulture. And so it was taking advantage of this Sustainable Wine Growing Australia data set, which is a pretty comprehensive and long-term data set. And so it meant that the growers were already reporting a whole lot of production and environmental data. So this study looked at about 400 growers, and about 67 of those then chose to share their financial information. And the work was looking at the relationship or the correlations between these production and environmental metrics and the financial performance. So what was quite nice with this one was that we actually saw a distinction between the most profitable vineyards and the least profitable vineyards. So the top 10% by gross margin, we're actually able to produce 1 tonne of grapes using about 47% less water, 59% less energy, and 63% less CO2 emissions. So that was really exciting to kind of see that come out in the data. And this is a pilot study, but we're looking to extend this further. And yeah, so that's part of it. But then the big question is, does that then translate to reduced or to increased resilience to the natural capital shocks? And so this is where we're going with this now. So as I mentioned, Francisco and I are working on that same kind of natural capital risk assessment, but this time in viticulture. So if these growers are already using water more efficiently, is water, one of the big risks or not? We have a master's project coming out. It's going to be advertised really shortly, so keep an eye out for that. And then, as I said, we'd like to extend this kind of work into other geographic areas. So there you go. That's the 30-second overview of that. Thank you.
No, thank you, Maddie. And so it gives us a sense of how those numbers get hung on those various metrics around practicability as well, because that's picking up. So, for example, biodiversity in the grape and wine industry is a very critical issue. And I guess for anyone out there, don't forget there's going to be a very attractive master's scholarship being advertised soon as well to work on it. So please keep that in mind as well. Look, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the seminar. So firstly, thank you, Francesco and Maddie, for bringing the light to what is often an oft talked about area, but it's often hard to hang them numbers on it and to understand how the thing actually works. So thank you again for your contributions, and ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to contact Francesco and Maddie offline if you have any further questions or would like to learn more. Don't forget, we'll be releasing a recorded version of this imminently, and as you know, for the frequent flyers amongst us, we'll send you an email link out so you can access the recordings, and it's good that Francesco shared some of the references and follow-up material at the end, because we'll make sure they're captured in the recorded footage so you can get access to those links. Our next seminar isn't going to be until a month after next, and in fact, we're going to continue this thread. And one of our HDR scholars, Stuart Martin, will be continuing a conversation on integrating natural capital accounting frameworks into decision-making, into practical agricultural decision-making. So we look forward to that. And of course, the reason we're not holding a research seminar next month is because, as the sign shows behind me, we have our summit coming up in the middle of next month. So please register, come along. We're going to be covering a whole raft of topics, ranging from agri-food innovation, supply chains, cybersecurity, international markets, trends, and of course, what's dearest to our heart, agri-food R&D innovation. And we'll have lots of projects and lots of our students being showcased. So thank you all for your time. Stay safe, and remember, for the sake of family, friends and colleagues, let's stick together in staying apart. Look forward to seeing you next time.